What got you there with What got you there with Sean Delaney? 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 What got you there with Sean Delaney?
Everyone, it seems, is in need of a strategy. That is why Sean was thrilled to talk with today's guest, Sir Lawrence Freedman. Freedman is the author of Strategy, A History, where he captures the vast history of strategic thinking in his consistently engaging and insightful account of how strategy came to pervade every aspect of our lives. In his behemoth of a book, Freedman gives a brilliant overview of the most prominent strategic theories in history, from David's use of deception against Goliath to the modern use of game theory in economics. This masterful volume sums up a lifetime of reflection on strategy. If you want to learn more about some of the most impactful strategists throughout history, such as the Greeks, Sun Tzu, Machiavelli, then keep listening.
Hey guys, I want to tell you about the brand I'm obsessed with right now. And you guys know I'm pretty obsessive about the brands I work with, especially when it comes to athletic apparel. You guys need to check out 10,000. You need to head to 10,000.cc and you guys can enter code WGYT and you're going to receive 20%. Yes, 20% off your entire order. Why do I love 10,000? 10,000 created the only training shorts you'll ever need. They do so by simplifying your options to deliver 3 premium shorts that perfectly cover all the ways you train. They have one built for versatility, another for durability, and one super lightweight, perfect for one of those runs or whatever else you do for fitness. No matter what you do, they have you covered. CrossFit, running, spin, yoga, lifting, or your weekend adventure. It doesn't matter what you do for fitness. They have a short for every way you train. They make it super simple, too, to find the right short. Just pick the short that's best for you, your lifestyle, personalize it with your individual needs with a custom liner and inseam options, and start getting after it. Not sure if they have the right short? No need to worry, you guys. Make a return or exchange. They offer free shipping, free exchanges, and free returns on every order. Like I said, 10,000 is my favorite brand right now. I am wearing their apparel all the time when I'm working out. I can't recommend them enough. Head to 10,000.cc, enter code WGYT, and you've got 20% off your entire order. Making change transpire. That's the mission behind the most amazing tasting protein bar brand taking the nutrition industry by storm. That brand, they're MCT Co, and they make the most delicious, keto-friendly, all-natural collagen protein bars. If you're obsessed with the quality of food going into your body like I am, then head out and pick up these amazing bars jammed with 10 grams of collagen protein. They only have 2 to 3 net carbs, no added sugar, and loaded with high-quality MCT oil for the healthy fats from coconuts. Whether you're busy running the kids around from activity to activity, a professional athlete, or just someone looking for a great-tasting convenience snack, do yourself a favor, head to mctco.com and use code WGYT for 20% off your order. So something I'm always intrigued about by the people that are featured on this show is routines, systems you've implemented throughout the day. What's a typical morning look like? Do you have any routines you usually do?
No, my routine involves having breakfast, bringing my wife a cup of coffee, putting the PC on and normally starting writing. Well, that's how I start most days when I can, unless I'm going to a meeting or to a conference or something. But that's how I like to start my days. I write better in the mornings than I do later on in the day.
You mentioned you're writing. How long are you typically writing for in the morning?
I'll normally try and write all morning. And if I'm really into it, I'll just carry on. But I start to fade quite quickly in the early afternoon. And then sometimes I pick up again in the evening as well. But the morning's the best time.
So do you ever get up during this time, or are you solely sitting there writing for a few hours straight?
Only for the normal purposes. Yeah, I mean, once I'm into it, I'm into it. I'm in a sort of different place and want to carry on while the going's good. I mean, obviously cups of coffee and so on are quite important to the process.
Yes, a few cups of coffee, always important to the process. You mentioned you're almost in a different zone, in a different state. Could you describe that?
Yeah. I find with writing that it sometimes, and most people find that it takes sometimes a while to get into, but at some point you realize you're onto something and the words are coming. Now, you may look back at what you've written and realize that it wasn't half as good as you thought it was when you're writing it. But you sort of know what's coming and the story's unfolding in front of you. I'm not the sort of writer who has it all planned out beforehand. So I do depend on the sort of it coming to me as I'm writing. I surprise myself as much as anybody else if it's going well. And while that's happening, everything else is almost blocked out. I'm impervious to what's going on around me. And I've always, in fact, been able to concentrate writing in some quite peculiar situations when there's with young children or even in meetings and so on. If I could get there with a pen and paper in front of me, I could still get something down.
That's absolutely fascinating. So when you are planning your day that you're going to go write, do you have any general guideline on what you're trying to accomplish that day, or you just sit down and write whatever flows to you?
I think once you're into a piece of work, I think you'll find many people who, I sort of write for a living now, but much of my career I didn't. I think you'll find many people who do are actually going back to what they wrote yesterday. Once you're, if you're writing a book, what I spend most of my time, or much of my time to start with anyway, is going back over what I did the day before. And it's partly polishing, it's partly seeing the direction of the argument, partly just getting yourself into it. This is why it's quite hard to write if it's spasmodic, if you have to go off and do other things and then get back into it again, and why a real burst of continual days on end when you can just get into something, it tends to be much more productive than those days spread across months.
You said you put pen to paper. Was that a figure of speech, or do you actually all of your writing done with pen and paper?
No. So now all my writing is done, or not all, 95% of it is done on a keyboard. But I'm old enough to remember, as they say, when you couldn't do that. And I'd say until not that far long ago, whereas it would seem a bit rude to start pulling out a laptop and start banging away when you're supposed to be taking what other people are saying at some significant meeting seriously, or in a conference or something, I could sort of sit quite happily scribbling away on a pad of paper. And then later on, I'd type it up. I was in senior management in the university, and middle management, probably all of my career. So I needed to make the most of my time.
No, I asked because the book of yours that I first became introduced with you, Strategy, it's a 751-page behemoth. So I figured your hand would have been awfully tired after writing that.
Yeah, it's some of it was written by hand because some of it was written in the 90s. I think, again, if you're trying to think through an idea and it's working, then it doesn't really matter whether you're scribbling on a pad or typing. But I think, again, those who don't remember the olden days can forget just how difficult it used to be to edit your own work. If you used to work on an old typewriter, the thought of putting in a new footnote was horrendous because all the other footnotes immediately became wrong. So the beauty of what you can do now with Word and so on is extraordinary. I mean, it just gives you sort of a freedom and an ability to, when I started my academic career, was just unobtainable.
You mentioned you started Strategy in the 90s. And I'm always fascinated by people's idea generation and research process into their books. So what did the process look like for making this book come to be?
Well, I sort of knew the book I wanted to write from quite early on in the 90s. I wanted to write a book that brought together in some way my three interests. I'd made my career, if you like, writing about military, in particular nuclear strategy. So I was au fait with all of that literature, and found it fascinating. From my sort of radical student days, I got very interested in politics, and it always intrigued me how those, largely from the left, but anybody who wanted to upend the political system, because they didn't have the resources evidently available to do it, yet had incredibly ambitious objectives, how they thought that through. It seemed to me a real challenge for any strategic thinking, and one reason why the left writing is just full of writing on strategy, because it's such a challenging thing for them. And then I found myself in management, and I'd read some of the management literature, but I'd had to deal with a lot of the issues that appeared in the textbooks, as it were, at first hand. I mean, by the time I finished, I was vice principal, sort of provosty sort of position at King's College London. So I was, involved in some quite big decisions. So I'd had some practical experience myself, and so that explained sort of the third strand in the book. But it took me an awfully long time to work out how I could do this. And there were a lot of false starts. And I think I often find with projects like this is the first thing you've got to do is to realize there's no quick fix. I mean, there's no shortcuts. You've just got to get into the material and find your own angles, and then it starts to work. But if you just try to read a couple of books or remember things you've read sometime in the past, to put down some clever thoughts, it never works. And you've got I had to accept that this was going to be a big deal and was going to take me quite a while if I was ever going to finish it.
Could you dive deeper on that? I think that's where the true gold in a lot of great work lies, that ability to continue on those false starts and keep pushing through. I'd love for you just to expand upon that.
Well, I think I'd always been aware of the fact that when you have what people call writer's block, when you sit there trying to work something through and it's just not working, and one cup of coffee leads to another, and you find yourself playing solitaire or something, then it's because there's a structural problem. It's not because your brain's not working properly as such, or you've lost the ability to write. You're trying to say something which can't be said, and you've got to unwind. And as you rewind, and as you do that, you're going to lose some stuff that you think, as you wrote it, was probably really classy, but it's got to go, and that's really hard to do. And I think that's so. The inclination is to persevere, and then there's a sort of moment almost of liberation where you realise that's pointless, and you've got to go back and start again, or at least go back to where the problems began. And I think so. I strongly believe, this is advice I would give to students as well, that structure is really important especially in academic writing. I think in any writing, you can sort of do streams of consciousness and then edit it, but thinking hard all the time about where your argument is going. What are the connections you've missed? What are the connections you've suddenly seen? How can you make them work? Have you is a bit you're working out on now really better at some other place earlier on, where you've just suddenly realised that there is they're actually talking about the same thing from a slightly different direction. But, those are the sort of decisions that are important, and where you have to be very honest with yourself when you're writing. And in the end, I think you've got to be your own most severe critic, as well as your own intended audience in a way. If you can't satisfy yourself, you're not going to satisfy anybody else.
You said perseverance is pointless. I'd love for you to expand upon when that happens to you, when you understand your brain might need a break. You mentioned solitaire. Is there anything you actually do?
Solitaire. I go for a walk, leave it for a while, do something else. I often like to have a couple of projects on the go. And sometimes when one bit of writing isn't working, you actually need to leave it for a while, despite what I said not long ago. Do something else. And then when you come back to it, you can see it with more honest eyes and freshly. So I think it's, eking out a few more sentences in the morning because you can't bear the thought of losing what you spent 3 previous mornings doing. That's what perseverance is. But at some point you've got to realize that it's not going to get you anywhere.
That's one of the realizations I've come to the past few years. Sometimes it's better to step away for a little while, clear the mind. You mentioned you like having different projects going on. I'm interested about your note-taking process. When you're going throughout life, are you taking down notes on all sorts of things, or are you pretty specific in what you're writing down?
No, I've been terrible at that. I've often thought I should do much more of it. I know all sorts of people who've got notebooks full of neat handwriting with all sorts of acute observations that they'll draw upon later date. But mine are just full of doodles and scribbles, and then I forget anyway. No, I immerse myself really so I like to do my research as I write. That I know that there's stuff out there that is relevant, and again, it's why writing these days is so much easier than it used to be. So if I think that there should be a connection, I just take an example from strategy. Max Weber and Leo Tolstoy were around at the same time. I was aware possibly that Tolstoy was of interest to Weber, but you can Google that. You can then find articles. And then while the idea is still fresh, I would make notes sufficient to my purposes on that. Now, in the olden days, again, that would have required trips to the library and a sudden realization that, I would have just found it difficult to find anything. I'd have to look through numerous journals in the hope of coming across something. But these ways, that you can come across something very quickly, decide whether it's of value or not. So I don't tend to have lots of notes upon which I draw. What I do is I read a lot around the subject. Some stuff sticks, some stuff doesn't. And then when as I need it during the course of writing, I'll go to the bookshelf or try to find the relevant article and work on it there and then. I don't believe in doing lots of research before I start writing.
You mentioned you immerse yourself, and I think that's one of the true important things to do to dive deep and really understand things. So when you're planning a book, do you have that total idea in your head, and then as something hits you, that's when you immerse yourself? Or are you immersing yourself hoping to find little nuggets to pull on?
I have a general idea about what I want to write about. I don't start with the introduction and work on. The bit I start with may end up being right in the middle of the book. It's just what grabs me at the time. So with the strategy book, I started with the military stuff because that was stuff that I knew. And then I got sort of playful, I suppose. I just thought, wouldn't it be I saw that a lot of the military stuff kept on going back to classical times. So I thought, well, I better look at that too. So I got into that. And then for quite separate reasons, I'd done describe a sort of a riff on the 10 plagues of strategy. It's coercive diplomacy. And so I started looking more at the Bible as a source of strategy. So it's one thing leads to another. That was an unusual book in that it was quite self-indulgent, and I had a very tolerant editor who didn't mind the increasing length and sort of diversity of topics I was covering. And with other books, you wouldn't, in a sense, be as playful as I was with that one. But the process still is similar, that I'll start at a place I feel I've got something to say, and then let one thing lead to another. It's not disciplined. I mean, other people are much more disciplined than I am. I'm disciplined in the fact that I can concentrate and will push myself, but I'm not. I don't think I've got it all. I just don't have it all sorted out in my head before I start.
We're talking a lot about routines, things that you implement and do. I'd be interested to hear, is there anyone you've researched or written about that just did something so unique in their daily routine?
Yeah. If you're looking at the people who interested me, again, looking at the strategy book, they were people who were often in the thick of things. I mean, they were prompted by events, so they didn't really have routines. It was events that excited them and made them think differently, and made them in those days put pen to paper with a view to trying to influence those events. So that's a lot of the people I've studied. I mean, I've listened to some of your podcasts, and I'm always impressed by these people who, sort of get up early, do their meditation, eat granola, and go on some fitness machines. And no doubt that's helpful to them. But a lot of the people I've been interested in are working in pretty chaotic conditions a lot of the time, with no idea how the events are going to unfold, and that's what gives the sort of drama and excitement to their writing, and the challenges they face. I think it's one reason why sort of military affairs and political affairs are different in many cases, not all, from business affairs, where sort of management I did at the university, where there was a routine. I mean, there were things that you just had to do, had to get over, meetings you had to attend on a regular basis. They weren't very exciting, but it had to be done. But I think a lot of the stuff I really enjoy writing about is driven by events, not by routines.
And that's one of my favorite things about having these conversations. You mentioned all these people wake up, jump on the fitness machine, and then hearing your perspective, some of these other people's perspectives. It's almost like we have this self-indulgent feedback loop, hoping to hear what we think should be done, and it's refreshing. You mentioned a lot of these people were made to think differently, and I'm intrigued about, during your research, what idea made you think the most differently after reading it?
That's a good question. I think so. There's I wouldn't sort of say these sort of big epiphanies, but there's a couple of sort of. Let me give two examples. And they're a bit academic-y, but I think they're relevant to sort of broader discussion of strategy. I mean, the first was the management literature itself. I mean, like a lot of people, I've been quite sniffy about it because I sort of moved into quite senior positions, and the stuff I'd read, which tended to be sort of airport bookstore stuff, I thought had been sort of statements of the blinding obvious. And I'd been on a couple of courses and so on, but I'd never really been one for the management gurus. And when I started doing my research, nothing really made me change my opinion of a lot of the sort of guru literature. But then I started to read other stuff, and I realized a lot of this was really quite good, and it wasn't, and that I'd been wrong to be quite so dismissive of it, because it was people who'd had experience and thought hard about it, or people I've been vaguely aware of, say like Peter Drucker, who possibly wrote too much, but some of his early stuff was so good, so original, that I was really pleased that I'd forced myself to look at it properly and take it seriously. And as I was doing this while still coming to the last stages, but still to a degree engaged in management, it did make me think differently about what I was doing in my everyday work. And the second example, which is quite relevant to a lot of the work I've done, is that, as you may know, in the social sciences, there's great debates about the role of quantification, about you have to measure everything and then do your statistical analysis to produce reliable conclusions that will give you causal theories and so on. And I'd again been very irritated with a lot of this, not because I was scared of the equations. I'd actually done maths up to a first year of university, but it just seemed to me to miss out on all the stuff that you couldn't measure, and produced conclusions with an illusion of precision. And the last big book I did on, it's called The Future of War, A History, which is about the way people have thought about the future of war. I started off going to prove how bad this stuff was. And I think a lot of the early stuff was pretty grim. But the more I looked, the more I realized that a lot of the younger academics that actually were well aware of the pitfalls and were managing to combine serious quantitative analysis when it was needed with history and political theory and what is often described as qualitative work. I'm doing some really good stuff. So it was a warning not to get too prejudiced about bodies of literature that you think you know, but until you actually get into them, you realize you don't know very well. And I think that would be the lesson of both of those examples. So I'm far more interested and tolerant in some of the new social science than I might have been before.
Are you always looking for new ideas?
Yeah. I mean, I can't understand people who write the same book over and over again. There's been some examples recently, and I just, I mean, you can make a pretty good career from one big idea, which you keep on recasting. I mean, academics have done that, or you're the one thing for which you'll be known, but it's boring. There's lots of good stuff out there, and also I've been in a very odd university department, Department of War Studies, which is there's not many of them, and they're naturally interdisciplinary. So I've always worked with people from other disciplines, and I find that immensely refreshing. So I mean, quite a long time ago now, I did a book on the theory of deterrence. Which is a big thing on nuclear strategy, military strategy. But there's a whole literature there in criminology. And as soon as I started reading that, then you've got new ideas coming from it. So I think, and keeping your mind open, but also being prepared to take the plunge into an unfamiliar literature. Stuff that may take a bit of effort to get your head around is the best way of keeping yourself fresh.
Now you really have me intrigued. This is one of my favorite things to do, It's probably a big reason I have this podcast, to hear different ideas, surround myself with people from other disciplines. Who else do you surround yourself with? I would love if a few other examples popped into your head here.
In what sense? Who else do I?
In terms of, you said you love finding out things from other disciplines.
Okay, so, well, I mean, I've partly, my job at one point was to be what you would see as a dean of a social science faculty. So I had to read lots of stuff then, and just to be able to stay abreast of what people were doing. So I've always had a pretty interested reach in social sciences, and I've always found literature an interesting source of ideas, and people don't use it enough because the great fiction writers have enormous insights into human behavior and political forces and so on. These days, I don't use Facebook, but I do use Twitter. I find that extraordinarily helpful in discovering things that I wouldn't otherwise be reading. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about how social media is used, but to me, it's been wonderful as a way of discovering what younger academics are doing, and suddenly somebody recommends something that I'd never have even thought of looking at before, and off you go, and it's a great read.
You and I are on the same page with the benefits and usefulness of Twitter. I find myself having to limit myself on it because I find so many new and interesting articles that I just have a massive folder of new literature to read. I'm also interested in things you've read that have stood the test of time for you. Let's talk specifically maybe some of that management literature you brought up a few minutes ago. Anything besides Peter Drucker's work that you'd recommend?
Well, Mintzberg, I think that was the first thing I read that I could see immediate applications to other work that I'd done in the military sphere. And it's quite interesting that is now, others have now picked up this idea of strategy as learning. So that was Richard Rummel. I've been impressed with. I think his work is understanding that a lot of strategy is really bad, and a lot of strategic ideas can be quite dangerous, because I think far too much of the business strategy literature was read this and you too could make $100 million, and when you read a lot of it, you say, no, it won't. And it actually it can get you into deep trouble. So, I mean, there are particular authors that I've enjoyed, that I would recommend other people to look at.
I'm thinking about someone a couple years out of college. We have a lot of young listeners of the show. They're going down the management route. You have direct experience. Any just big overarching advice you'd have for someone like that?
I mean, academic management is not that different from other forms, but academics are a funny bunch. So you've got to be prepared to deal with some quite huge egos who always like to have the last word. So you do need very specific skills in the academic world. The best advice I was ever given at a relatively young age was, if you want anything to be done, keep your ego out of it. That as soon as you worry about, as soon as you start taking offense or worrying about people getting cross or wanting to make a point about how clever you are and how authoritative you are and so on, then you're losing sight of what you're actually trying to achieve. So that was advice I've always tried to follow. Is not to get too egotistical. The other advice, not I was given, but I give to others, is be prepared to admit you're wrong. my approach to most things was I felt I should take the lead. I was in leadership position, so I had to take the lead, and I would often do so in quite an apparently decisive way, but make it clear to anybody who disagreed that they must say so and why. And there's only any point in asking people to do that and going through what is often laughingly called consultation, if you're actually prepared to change your mind. Otherwise, people see it as fraudulent. So I think never, obviously you get things wrong because you've missed something. I mean, the great benefit of working with bright people is they're going to point these things out to you. And if you just ignore them, again, because you feel your ego is under attack if you don't get your way, then you're going to end up with some bad policies. So I think, and it's quite hard often because you've often invested quite a lot in being right, to accept that you got something wrong. But I think unless you can do that, then you're never going to get people to give you honest advice.
That's some sound advice you just gave there, especially around getting things wrong. I'm intrigued, though, now being able to look back over a lot of successes throughout your career. What do you think are some of the things that you just ended up doing right, whether that be listening to great advice, surrounding yourself with good people, anything you've been able to articulate over the years?
Well, I mean, I think surrounding yourself, never being afraid of having bright people around you. I mean, the most of the management failures I saw were by people who were scared of subordinates who were cleverer than they were, or they feared were cleverer than they were. When building up university department and then at school, my basic instinct was if I saw a bright person, to try to find a way of getting them. I wanted them with me. Also, you've got to take pleasure in the success of other people. And this is especially true in a university. You mark your success by other people doing well. And if you sort of get consumed with jealousy as that happens, then again, you're not going to be successful. The mentoring and encouraging part of the job, I always thought was the most rewarding. And even now, when I go, back to my college and my old department and so on, I can see things going on that I know that I gave a push to, and I find that immensely satisfying. So, you work through other people, and so you rely on them to succeed, and you fail if they fail. I think the other thing, which is again probably relevant, certainly in an academic career, is it always helps when you're asking somebody to do something if you've done it yourself already. This is why, despite being extremely busy at times, I always kept on writing and doing academic work, because it wasn't good enough to show that I'd done it at some point. It was important to show that I could still do it. And I knew the problems that they were facing and could talk about who's writing what and what the sources were and so on. So I think if you're just sort of barking orders at people without any understanding of what it takes to implement those orders, then you can't be too surprised if it all goes wrong.
Something you brought up is the importance of surrounding yourself with the brightest people. And it's one of my favorite things. When I see what I deem as greatness or quality I admire, I try to dive deeper with that person to figure out more. This is the question I ask, and people seem to hate answering. They never want to answer. Who do you think might be the brightest person that you've come across in all your work?
That's an impossible question. But they're different because they're different. I've got, some people I'm really proud of, to see what they've achieved. And it's not just brightness. It's not just being intellectually clever. It's other qualities of character as well that have got them where they are today. I've a former student of mine who came to the UK from Nigeria, who was, she'd been had a reasonable academic record. She did okay when she came to do our master's program. But she had real commitment to the field, real perseverance. Went on to do some work for the United Nations, set up new programs for women's leadership in Africa, and is now sort of vice president for international affairs at my college. And I get enormous pride from her work. I mean, I know I helped her at certain times, was able to help, but by God, she did it by herself. But it's not just being clever. I mean, she is clever, but that's only a real one part of the story. And I've got other students the nice thing about being in the academic world and reaching a certain age is that you've got, wherever I go, I can see lots of my students who have achieved great things, sometimes in the books they've written, sometimes in their teaching, sometimes in moving to management positions. But I think this one, just because of the sort of the toughness of her early upbringing, is one that gives me most pleasure.
No, thank you for expanding upon the question there. Yeah, I don't necessarily need a specific, but it's just fun to hear about what your inputs are, what you deem as interesting qualities. A few minutes ago, you were talking about ego, and something that's come up a lot on this show is people's ego changes over time. They usually start off egotistical, and as they get older, they drop more of their ego. What do you think's changed the most for you throughout your career?
It's hard to say. I mean, I started off, I don't want to overdo it, but, I let's say lower middle class from the northeast of England, which, if you know, the UK is a pretty out of the way sort of place. So it made me sort of a bit sort of left wing, but also a bit unsure, lacking confidence with people who'd been to better schools. And my school was a good one, but it wasn't one of the top private schools. And I just scraped into university and so on. So getting confidence, I think, is really important. It took, I know I always had a degree of confidence in my ability to write and talk. It took a while before I actually had confidence that I was good at what I was doing. That I really could, I could get away with it, and that if people said it was good, it may be that they were right rather than just being nice to me. And I think once you've got that confidence, then you really don't need to be that pushy or egotistical, because you know that you're working on stuff that you can do, and that if you pay attention, that it's probably going to be okay. And then you make mistakes. I mean, having confidence can also lead you into hubris and thinking you can do things when you can't. So I make mistakes, and you learn from them. But I think that's the main thing. And then, partly because I suppose I stayed in the same institution for my career, most of my career, although in different roles. Just by having been around a long time and knowing how the institution worked and how to get things done, you can have an authority that means that if you say to somebody, I think we should do it this way, then they're going to listen to you. So that's a nice thing to have. But as I say, the danger with that is that they don't contradict you enough. So I think, all in all, I think being confident, being able to speak with a degree of authority is something you acquire over time. And it's a nice position to be in, but it can also set you up for a fall. So unless you're, I think anybody who's totally convinced in themselves is heading for trouble. You've always got to have that nagging doubt about yourself that be aware that however good you think you may be, you're capable of making some horrendous error. I think for anybody who's researching, there's too many stories around of people with well-established names who suddenly find that they've lifted a chunk of somebody else's writing, possibly inadvertently, and that's their career gone. So, if you get super confident in yourself, you're just setting yourself up.
How old were you when you developed this newfound confidence?
I suppose quite young, because first I got quite involved in student politics, which was an odd place to be in the late 60s and early 70s, but I learned a lot from that. But I was running a small unit in a think tank by my late 20s, and then became a full professor in my early 30s and running a department. So I had to develop it pretty quickly. Otherwise, I would have been eaten alive. On that basis, I had a pretty good career. But I was lucky. I mean, timing's a lot of these things. Getting a job that allows you to do the things you want to do, it can just be fate, just be fortuitous. So, but I've been running stuff really since my late 20s. So I don't think you can ask people to do things unless you've got a degree of confidence. So, from them.
What you're discussing now makes me think of a sentence in the opening paragraph of your book, and that sentence is, having a strategy suggests an ability to look up from the short term and the trivial, to view the long term and the essential, to address causes rather than symptoms, to see the woods rather than trees. It's a line I absolutely love, and I'm just so intrigued about what you were just mentioning. What did you think was going to be the long term for you when you were very young, say early 20s?
Certainly not being a professor of war studies. I wanted to go into politics, to be honest. I was quite activist. I was always too moderate for my own good. So in those radical days, I had the irritating ability to see another side to an issue and too much of a sense of irony. And I think they sort of worked against me. But I sort of lost my appetite for that for a variety of reasons by the time I was working on my PhD. And I was very lucky. I came. My interest had been in domestic politics rather than international politics, but I started to get interested in these big issues of nuclear strategy and so on. But my real good fortune was coming to Oxford and having somebody who's actually still alive, Michael Howard, who's one of the sort of great military historians of our age, as my supervisor. And so I could actually pinpoint the moment when I worked out what I wanted to do, because I discovered this man who I hadn't heard about before was my supervisor, and thought, well, at the very least I ought to read his books. So I went off and found a collection of his essays, and I sort of read from start to finish. Started at sort of 2 PM and was still going 2 in the next morning, and well, this is what I want to do. I just loved the way he addressed issues, could write about them, moved into sort of considerable detail, but then could capture a whole period of history in a few paragraphs. And he became my mentor as well. So I was very fortunate in that regard. He knew everybody. He always gave me good advice. And that's why I take mentoring seriously myself. I mean, I was very fortunate, and it made all the difference. So I know exactly when I changed my mind about what I was going to do.
I'm so fascinated that you just mentioned you've been able to pinpoint that specific moment you knew what you were going to do. And maybe it's just my lack of experience and haven't come in contact with enough people who've been able to do that. Can you describe that experience more? How do you even have the ability to understand that moment and know what to do next then?
Because it was a moment when, I was pretty well versed in political theory. I've been reading quite a lot about it. I got interested in a lot of the military literature and some of the nuclear literature, but it hadn't really come together in my head. And I hadn't quite worked out a point of view, not in the sense of opinions, but just a perspective, how one would approach these issues. And Michael Howard is a man who had an amazing war record, but then started as a straightforward military historian. But because he was based near what was then the center of the newspaper industry, he kept on being called upon to comment on contemporary events because he was a lecturer and then a professor in war studies. He'd set up the department I went on to run. So he had a real historical sensibility, but was prepared to use that to comment on contemporary issues. He also had a beautiful writing style. So I hadn't read anything like it before, but it touched on lots of things that I already knew interested me and wanted to talk about. So it was just, and it was not afraid of taking positions on issues as well, without being sort of ranting or polemical. So I just thought, well, this is how to do it. And I've still got the book with all my annotations in it and so on. It really was a sort of revelation about how something could be done.
You mentioned Michael Howard is this great mentor of yours. That's a big hot topic for a lot of people looking for a mentor that they can learn from. What did you do really well, both to make him want to mentor you, and then just to learn as much from him as possible?
Well, I remember the first thing he said to me was, "Good God, you're not an American," because most of his students were American. Brits weren't going into his field at the time. So he was immensely relieved to find somebody from the UK who actually wanted to work on this stuff. I mean, this was sort of, the sort of Vietnam generation and all of that. People didn't want to study military affairs. And I remember in one of my early supervisions, he had these wonderful rooms at All Souls College in Oxford, which is almost a caricature of what people imagine Oxford to be like. So surrounded by books all over the place. I was in awe of all of that. And I remember was having a supervision when some journalists rang him up and he started to talk about whatever was going on at the time and said, well, if this goes on much longer, I'm going to have to charge for this. And I thought, gosh, I wish I would love to be able to say that one day. So he was somebody who, again, was very confident in himself and not afraid. I mean, he could do some quite scathing put-downs. But when I needed support, he was always there. And so when I did a lot of my research in the States. And, I came to the US armed with letters to almost everybody of importance because he knew them. Other people were really helpful to me as well. But he was sort of the role model and, was keen to help me. As he'd been keen to help many other people. It wasn't just me at all. I wasn't his favorite. There were a lot of other people who he also helped. And because I think once you accept that a mentoring role, then it's not hard to find a number of people with whom even one short conversation can make a difference. And sometimes conversations you forget that they remind you of later on, oh, you told me to do this, and here I am now. And I don't even remember telling them that, but it's great that that the advice worked for them. But it's a relationship, that continues to my day. I mean, he's 96ish, and but still all there intellectually, and somebody I try to go and see every couple of months. So it was a particularly close relationship.
A few minutes ago, you said you had an irritating ability to see the other side of things. Yeah. And how important is that, those opposing views, both in your own life and then also some of the great military leaders throughout our time, being able to listen to some of their close advisors who had different opinions? How essential is that?
Oh, I think it's really important. I think if you, if you grow up and you're not wholly sure about where you stand on anything, whether it's about religion or politics or whatever, then you should have competing voices in your head anyway. I always used to say to students that we'll know how well you're doing if you can give a pretty convincing exposition of a view with which you totally disagree. Because only if you can do that can you counter arguments with which you disagree. You've got to understand it. Otherwise, you just keep on missing the point, and any objections you may have can be brushed off. So I've always thought a sort of degree of empathy, I think is probably the right word, is essential. And as I've said before, sometimes also they may be right. So there's always that shock when you realize they're right and you're wrong. And it happens. I think in terms of I think one of the things about military strategy, and I'd say it's probably true about a lot of political strategy as well, the difficult thing is to so much. I think there's a point at which you're trying to formulate your ideas, trying to work out what to do, when you need to listen widely and think hard about what competitors, rivals, enemies, or whatever might also be trying to do. And then there's a point where you've decided what to do and you've told everybody what's going to happen and it's fixed. And then if you keep on having doubts after that, you're going to get into trouble, which is why it's important to really look hard before you make a final decision. And I think if you look at a lot of great, in Second World War history, they spent a lot of time, Montgomery and Rommel, they spent a lot of time thinking about what each other was likely to be doing. Sometimes they got it right, sometimes they got it wrong, but it was important to them, at least helping them formulate some ideas. And sometimes it doesn't even matter if you're wholly right about what they might do, because you can't know for sure. But it gives you something upon which to start developing your ideas, to think things through. So, but once you've made up your mind, then indecision, shifting tack, and so on, unless because of events that force you to do so, it's just going to undermine your authority. So, getting things sorted out before the big decisions are made is really important. And then when you've made the decisions, normally you've got to live with them. And in military terms, that's a hell of a lot. And you can sort of, if you look at someone like Robert E. Lee, who's coming back into the news, he was very good at his great strength was always in anticipating what his opponents might do and where their weaknesses was. Until he got it wrong at Gettysburg. And he realized he got it wrong. His judgment left him. But, up to that point, it had all gone well. So, that's the problem, that you I can't say you make mistakes. You've always got to realize you're going to make mistakes. But at some point, you've got to make a decision and stick with it. In academic, that's why academics make terrible politicians. Often because they're not very good at being so stubborn that they won't budge even when they've made a decision which may not be absolutely perfect. And so, oh gosh, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. When everybody's busy acting upon the previous decision, the time to listen to other people and take counsel is before the big decision is made. But academics are bad at that.
I just realized the time. Do you have a hard cutoff right now?
No, not really. I'm quite happy.
Okay. Oh, fantastic. You have me mesmerized by this conversation. So you mentioned sorting out before the big decisions are made. It makes me think of a line you brought up by Clausewitz, and that is, everything in war is very simple, but the simplest thing is very difficult. So after all of the research you've done 200 years later, does that still hold true?
Oh, yeah. I think it goes back to the previous quote about what strategy involves in seeing the wood and not just trees and so on. The hardest thing is to keep the big picture in view while working on the problem at hand. And I think again, one of the hardest things in management is knowing how far to drill down into the detail, because simple things are complicated. You can say to somebody, well, this needs to be done. Can you make sure it's done, without any idea of what you've just asked somebody to do, and they just sort of slink away and feel they have to do what they can. And then when things are going wrong, you sort of start to drill down yourself and realize there's this problem and that problem that you'd never even thought of. But you just can't. You just don't have the time to do that on most issues. So I think, at any level of decision making, things are complicated enough, and if you get overwhelmed by the complexity, by trying to second guess everybody else's decision, you just paralyze yourself. There's just too much there. I think as most people, I'm sure, other people I'm sure have said to you, delegation is really one of the hardest things for precisely that reason. You do have to trust other people to manage their particular set of complexities, because you've got enough on your plate with your own.
Is that something you've become better with over the years?
Yeah. Well, I partly because I took on more responsibility, more people reporting to me, and so on. So you had to learn the art of delegation. I'm not quite sure. I think of an Americanism that quite explains this, but there's sort of also a point in a career where you realize, you know what you can do. You're now doing the best job you're ever going to get, and you shouldn't worry anymore about all the about dressing up difficult decisions. And I got more direct as I got older. Not rude, I hope. No, I would never try to be. I would never believed in being rude or abusive or shouting at people, but certainly would try to get to the point much more quickly than I used to. I think actually it's one of the things that email does, possibly to a fault now. When you have to write memos and letters, they can get very florid at times, and lots of unnecessary preliminaries, where email tends to make people somewhat more direct, and sort of Twitter and WhatsApp even more so. But I found I was getting much more over time. I just get to the point where this is why we're having this conversation. This is what I think needs doing. These are the objections. What do you think? You can get things over quite quickly.
At this point in your career, what are some of the other things you're best at?
My career in a way is now just writing. That's all I do, and because that's what I enjoy most, and so it's what I'm best at. But that's what I enjoy most, and I can turf up to conferences and make my pitches. Let me say what I was bad at, because it makes me sound a bit of a goody-goody if I'm not careful. I got bored with routines, and a lot of good management is is making sure the routines are going on properly. And if something didn't really engage me intellectually or interest me, I could let it go. And I can think of things which I'm not at all proud of in that case. So I enjoy, I'd say, the creative part of management. What I was good at was institution building, if you like, on quite a small scale often, but not setting up new initiatives, getting the right people to run them, which was always key, making sure they were funded, enthusing people to do that. I could be quite good on that sort of thing. But once they were set up, which is when trouble could often develop, I could take my eye off the ball. And I think that's, so I would criticize myself for. Other people were much better at keeping an eye on the routines. And because a lot of good management is keeping an eye on budgets, for example, making sure not too many people are being acquired whose salaries you can't really afford. And and if you're too excited about the creative stuff, you can forget that. I had to keep on reminding myself, but the fact that I had to remind myself, I'd say that was a weakness. But the creative stuff I was quite good at.
I feel like I'm talking to myself in the future. You're describing the way I work, and I love the early stage, getting the correct people in place and making that business more efficient. So what do I need to really concentrate on and remind myself of?
I keep on coming back to it, that we're all fallible. And we're working in imperfect organizations. All organizations are imperfect. All people are fallible. And therefore, when people screw up, you should always, I always try to give people a second chance. Somebody once observed to me that I gave people a clean sheet of paper. There was, I think you just have to accept that the mistake, you'll make mistakes and other people will make mistakes. And that's the way you learn and pick up. Obviously some mistakes are if you're in the area of fraud or criminality or harassment or whatever, then they're not forgivable mistakes. But a lot of mistakes are just because of sloppiness or inattention, or because you've never confronted something like this before, or you mix the numbers up or something, and those sort of things shouldn't be career threatening. In every organization I've ever had anything to do with, people are always complaining about coordination and this bit, the organization not knowing what the other bit is doing and contradicting each other. And these things are just features of organizational life. And I think if you accept that, you can make the organization work a lot better, because you're not trying to perfect it. So I think, so maybe it's a strange way to start with flaws and mistakes, but I just think it just makes you tolerant. I think tolerance is quite important. I've never at all been impressed by managers who shout a lot. And I used to say, when I was running a department, that the only person who can be shouted at is me, because it didn't matter to me if I got shouted at. But if a well-paid academic started shouting at some secretary who hadn't quite understand what he'd been trying to say, I was very unimpressed. I think, and then, as part of that is discovering what people are really good at. And I think that's often comes as a surprise, especially when you've worked with people for a long time and you suddenly realize that they've got a knack, that they're very good at getting people to work with them. I had one colleague who I wouldn't necessarily put in charge of anything, but had an extraordinarily creative mind when it came to working through some bureaucratic problems. He just was really good at it. so just seeing what people can do and giving them the chance to do it, and knowing what they can't do, it normally gets the best out of the people in the organisation. So, but that requires, I think, paying quite a lot of attention to people, getting to know them, chatting with them. I think that was the other thing that I found as time went on that actually was quite difficult. When you're you're running a department, say, which is quite smallish, you get to know everybody. I know the staff, know the students, everybody, and keeping your ear to the ground, you could see a problem coming. You could tell that two people weren't getting on. For whatever reason, it wasn't working, and you could take measures to keep them apart or tell one to get over it, explain how they should deal with the situation. You could deal with it. The higher up you get, the more that sort of ground truth starts to elude you. And if somebody's telling you that everything is fine, it's the easiest thing to do is just to believe them. And I used to put a certain amount of effort, but I don't think quite enough, into quite walking the corridors, but just chatting to people to give them opportunities to tell me if there were things they weren't happy with. And I think that that's the biggest problem for senior management. I think, and I've seen it in my study, never mind my own experience and studying policy making. I mean, I spent 7 years of my recent life on the UK's Iraq inquiry, looking at how the mistakes that were made in Iraq, and never mind the mistakes that led to the war. A lot of those that followed with the occupation and so on were the result of people hearing things they wanted to hear, and not being told awkward truths. And so I think that is one of the real tasks of senior management is not to rely too much on the hierarchy to provide them with of evidence that things are not going quite right.
It's a fine balance to have the broad vision to be able to push the business forward, and then also understand the little details that could really impede the progress. And so I've had experience both in business and sports. I haven't had any within military strategy, but something that I would always hear about growing up, whether that be in sports or in business, is a lot of these leaders and coaches had studied Sun Tzu. How applicable are his lessons, whether it be in business or sports, or is this something that's just been overblown?
It's certainly been overblown. Sun Tzu's a great read. I mean, he's much easier to read than Clausewitz. Some good aphorisms, which whether the true Sun Tzu scholars will tell you we don't properly understand it, but what you take out of it. I think the difficulty with Sun Tzu is that he's basically saying that if we're cleverer than our opponent, we can win. And who isn't going to go for a strategy that for clever people? And a lot of the cleverness is based on deception. That if the enemy attacks, we retreat. If the enemy thinks if the enemy thinks we're cowards, we've got to be heroic. Whatever the enemy thinks, you have to do the opposite. And this is fine until somebody else has also read Sun Tzu. And they're also doing the wrong thing. They're doing the same thing, and you never actually engage at all. So it's interesting that a lot of the appearances of Sun Tzu are in The Sopranos or Wall Street, where it's always the villains that find him attractive, because it is about deception. A lot of the time. So by all means, read it. I mean, there is good advice in that. But I think, like all of these things, it works because you read something, and it seems to be applicable to your own situation and things that are already bothering you. If you turn the page, you'd read something else which isn't, but you ignore that because you found something that seems to work. So I I certainly don't tell it. I wouldn't tell anybody not to read it, but I think the idea that all strategic wisdom is there is certainly overblown.
Something I really enjoyed you brought up in the book was game theory. And I would just love to hear your overall thoughts on game theory and how it can be applied in our overall strategy, whatever it is we're involved in life.
Well, I mean, I have mixed feelings about it. I think as many people do. I think game theory was extremely influential in the 50s, early 50s. So one of my sort of intellectual heroes is Tom Schelling, who eventually got the Nobel Prize in economics for game theory and its applications, particularly in nuclear strategy. But Schelling himself was very cautious about how he described its value, because he was very clear he didn't believe in mathematical proofs of things. He didn't believe it was a science. What he really liked was the 2x2 matrix, which is a pretty good way of presenting problems. So I think, once you've read a certain amount of game theory, then you sort of see prisoners' dilemmas all over the place, and you can see the paradoxes and why it might lead people into certain positions. I think the danger of it is that is when people make it such a thing that you get these sort of long analyses with metagames on metagames, and all to reach a conclusion that a simple bit of thought might have got you to without going through quite the same amount of intellectual effort. So, like all of these things, it works best when looking at relatively simple situations. You have to remember that its origins lay in an attempt to develop a theory for poker playing. That was what they were trying to do in situations where what you do depends on your expectations of what somebody else might do, and just realizing that that's the game of which you're a part is pretty good. I mean, that's actually quite an insight. So I think in limited terms, it's really helpful. But like all of these things, if you make too much of a meal of it, you'll spend a lot of time developing some elaborate methodologies to come up with possibly some rather banal conclusions.
I love being able to see both sides there. I really appreciate you bringing up the danger in it. I could literally spend an entire day with you, so I'm gonna finish up here. If you were gonna create, call it a round table of advisors of some of the greatest military strategists that you've studied, who would they consist of?
Oh, God, that's a difficult one. Well, there'd be such an eclectic group that I'm sure they'd spend their time arguing with each other. So I mentioned Schelling, who was wrong on a number of things, but just had a completely original take on the world, I think, partly because game theory told him about the interdependence of decision-making, about the way that your decisions affect the decisions of others, which seems to be the heart of any strategy. I think I would bring in von Moltke, who was sort of the architect of German unification in the wars of the sort of late 1860s to leading up to the Franco-Prussian War, because he not only understood the importance of the staff work, not following the rules when the situation changed, but he described strategy as a system of expedients, which I always thought was a good way of thinking about it, about the need to adapt and to think things through. Going back, you'd probably have to have Clausewitz there, though he's quite hard work. Just because he understood the interplay, but he understood the role of chance and friction, and the interplay of means and objectives, and the importance of objectives. What are you trying to do? But he understood particularly the friction and chance and how things can go wrong. I quite like Wellington. A Brit in there, because he was incredibly good organizer. I mean, he really did the preparation. I think that's probably true of a lot of the British generals, is that they weren't, didn't necessarily have great flair, but because it wasn't, we weren't always very good in land battles, they had to do their preparations. Montgomery was an awkward character, so I wouldn't really want him around my table, but he was a clever general for that reason. And I've known, I've got to know over the time some people who've been involved in big strategic decisions, and most of them are very reflective about what they've had to do. I mean, because they're working in an area where people die. I mean, this is, in the end, one of the differences between military strategy and business strategy is that if you get it wrong, people die, and even if you get it right, people are going to die, and that weighs heavily on people, and so it should. And I think that produces sort of seriousness in those who've been involved, which is why it's so irritating when you see politicians be very sort of relaxed and cavalier about armed force. I mean, the people who do it properly are never cavalier about it. They're never careless with it. They're never reckless, really. Or some are reckless, but the successful ones aren't. They think very hard about it, which is why you can learn a lot from them.
Well, learning a lot is something I truly have done from you and your work, so I can't tell you how much I appreciate this time. I'd love to know, are you working on any new books? Anything else that we can look forward to?
Well, oddly, I'm trying to write something not about war, but about some of the strategic decisions in the making of the digital age, if that makes any sense. So why did the transistor develop the way it did and lead to microprocessors? Why did hobbyists produce the first home computers? Those sort of questions, which lots of people have dealt with, and I'm probably silly to think I can say anything new about it, but it just interests me that I sort of know a bit about it, but not enough, and it's an area that's interesting. So I'm toying with that, and I'm also toying with a more mainstream thing for me, I suppose, doing something on command, on the concept of command, which is very important in the military sphere, but latest thinking on command is quite interested by thinking in the business sphere. So that's also something. But I'm in the unusual position of having finished the books I was committed to do. So actually quite enjoying myself reading around, trying to get some ideas.
Well, if you move forward with either of those, I'm going to be incredibly excited. I think I'm going to have to fly over there. Hopefully we can sit down in person and do this. But I know you mentioned you're active on Twitter. Anywhere else the listeners can stay connected with you?
Twitter's the main thing. I'm quite. I mean, they have to be pretty interested in Brexit at the moment because that's what we're all obsessed with that over here. But I do tweet quite a lot on international conflicts and so on, as well as our own problems. And I mean, I like Twitter because it also appeals to my sense of humor as well. There's lots of nasty stuff on Twitter, but by and large, I found it pretty refreshing.
Well, we'll have that linked up, but I cannot thank you enough for joining us on What Got You There.
I've enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Hey guys, I want to tell you about the brand I'm obsessed with right now. And you guys know I'm pretty obsessive about the brands I work with, especially when it comes to athletic apparel. You guys need to check out 10,000. You need to head to 10,000.cc and you guys can enter code WGYT and you're going to receive 20%. Yes, 20% off your entire order. Why do I love 10,000? 10,000 created the only training shorts you'll ever need. They do so by simplifying your options to deliver 3 premium shorts that perfectly cover all the ways you train. They have one built for versatility, another for durability, and one super lightweight, perfect for one of those runs or whatever else you do for fitness. No matter what you do, they have you covered. CrossFit, running, spin, yoga, lifting, or your weekend adventure. It doesn't matter what you do for fitness. They have a short for every way you train. They make it super simple, too, to find the right short. Just pick the short that's best for you, your lifestyle, personalize it with your individual needs with a custom liner and inseam options, and start getting after it. Not sure if they have the right short? No need to worry, you guys. Make a return or exchange. They offer free shipping, free exchanges, and free returns on every order. Like I said, 10,000 is my favorite brand right now. I'm wearing their apparel all the time when I'm working out. I can't recommend them enough. Head to 10,000.cc, enter code WGYT, and you've got 20% off your entire order. Making change transpire. That's the mission behind the most amazing tasting protein bar brand taking the nutrition industry by storm. That brand, they're MCT Co, and they make the most delicious, keto-friendly, all-natural collagen protein bars. If you're obsessed with the quality of food going into your body like I am, then head out and pick up these amazing bars jammed with 10 grams of collagen protein. They only have 2 to 3 net carbs, no added sugar, and loaded with high-quality MCT oil for the healthy fats from coconuts. Whether you're busy running the kids around from activity to activity, a professional athlete, or just someone looking for a great-tasting convenience snack, do yourself a favor, head to mctco.com and use code WGYT for 20% off your order.
What got you there with Sean Delaney? What got you there with Sean Delaney? What got you there with Sean Delaney? What got you there with got you?
Thanks for listening to another episode of What Got You There. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave us a review on iTunes and also share with your friends. Thanks so much. Looking forward to talking with you next time. If you want to stay up to date on all things I'm working on behind the scenes and everything we've got going on at What Got You There, head over to whatgotyouthere.com. You'll also be able to see more on podcast guests and what they're doing. Thanks to Justin Great for providing us the intro and outro song. If you like his music and want to find out more about what he's working on, head over to justingreat.com.